The security guards dragged the elderly black woman out of the five-star hotel lobby without knowing she owned the entire building and could fire every one of them with a single phone call. 77-year-old Mrs. Josephine Carter stood on the marble steps of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel that cold December evening, clutching her worn overnight bag while watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as wealthy guests sipped champagne in the lobby she had personally designed 32 years ago. To assistant manager Brandon Walsh, the 28-year-old who had ordered her removal, she looked like exactly the kind of vagrant his training had taught him to eliminate before she could disturb paying customers. What he didn't know was that the woman he'd just humiliated had built this hotel from nothing, transforming a dream born in 1955 when she was 7 years old, watching her grandmother clean rooms at a segregated hotel in Atlanta, into a $200 million hospitality empire spanning 12 cities. The cruel irony was devastating. Mrs. Carter possessed documents in her overnight bag that proved she owned not just this hotel, but the entire chain. Every marble tile Brandon stood on, every crystal chandelier casting warm light over the reception desk, every employee who had rushed past her like she was invisible, all of it belonged to the elderly black woman they had treated like trash. The mahogany reception desk where Brandon now stood, radiating authority, had been crafted to Mrs. Carter's exact specifications when she was 45 and determined to prove that excellence knew no racial boundaries. The security protocols he'd used to justify her expulsion were policies she had written to protect legitimate guests, not to exclude people based on assumptions about their worth. In 60 seconds, Mrs. Carter would walk back through those doors and reveal the truth that would change everything. But first, she stood in the cold, remembering the promise she'd made as a child. Someday, she would own a place where people like her were welcomed, not expelled. The journey that had brought Mrs. Carter to this moment of profound irony began 70 years earlier in rural Mississippi, where she was born Josephine May Washington in 1946 to parents who worked as sharecroppers on land they would never own. Her earliest memories were shaped by her grandmother's stories about the fancy hotels in Atlanta, where she worked as a housekeeper, cleaning rooms and serving people who lived in a world that seemed impossibly distant from the cotton fields and one-room schoolhouse that defined young Josephine's daily reality. The transformation from that sharecropper's daughter to the owner of a luxury hotel empire was a journey that required every ounce of determination, intelligence, and business acumen that Mrs. Carter had developed through decades of overcoming barriers that others insisted were impossible to cross. Her path to success had been shaped by her grandmother's wisdom about the importance of education, her parents' work ethic, and her own unwavering belief that excellence could overcome prejudice if it was persistent enough and strategic enough to outlast discrimination. The first glimpse of the world she would eventually enter came in 1955, when 9-year-old Josephine accompanied her grandmother to work at the Peachtree Plaza Hotel in Atlanta during the summer months when school was not in session. The experience of walking through service corridors and observing the operations of a major hotel opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined, while also revealing the stark realities of racial segregation that limited where people like her could work and what positions they could aspire to achieve. The conversations that Mrs. Carter's grandmother shared during their long walks home from the hotel provided the foundation for understanding both the hospitality industry and the broader economic systems that created wealth and opportunity for some people while excluding others based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their capabilities or potential for success. Her grandmother's observations about hotel management, customer service, and business operations became the informal education that would later inform Mrs. Carter's approach to building her own hospitality empire. The decision to pursue higher education was made when Mrs. Carter was 15 years old and recognized that formal credentials would be essential for advancement in industries that were dominated by people who questioned the competence and legitimacy of black women in leadership positions. Her acceptance at Spelman College in 1964 represented not just personal achievement, but also a family investment in possibilities that previous generations had been denied access to pursue. The college years that followed were characterized by academic excellence and growing awareness of the business opportunities that existed within the hospitality industry for someone who understood both customer service and operational efficiency. Mrs. Carter's studies in business administration provided the theoretical framework for understanding finance, marketing, and management, while her summer jobs at hotels and restaurants gave her practical experience in the day-to-day operations that would inform her later success as an owner and operator. The graduation from Spelman in 1968 with a bachelor's degree in business administration marked the beginning of Mrs. Carter's professional journey in the hospitality industry, but it also coincided with social and economic changes that were creating new opportunities for black entrepreneurs while simultaneously maintaining many of the barriers that had traditionally excluded them from ownership and leadership positions in major industries. The early years of Mrs. Carter's career were spent working in management positions at hotels in Atlanta, Birmingham, and Memphis, where she gained experience in every aspect of hospitality operations while consistently being passed over for promotions that went to less qualified candidates whose primary advantage was their race and gender. The frustration of being overlooked despite superior performance became the motivation for eventual entrepreneurship and ownership rather than continued employment in organizations that failed to recognize her potential. The decision to purchase her first hotel in 1985 was prompted by Mrs. Carter's recognition that ownership would provide the autonomy and control necessary to implement the customer service standards and operational practices that she had been developing throughout her management career. The property she selected was a failing 40-room motel in Birmingham that could be acquired at a price that reflected its poor condition rather than its potential for improvement and success. The renovation of that first property required Mrs. Carter to invest not just her financial resources, but also her time, energy, and personal labor in creating something exceptional from what others had dismissed as hopeless. The 18 months of construction and preparation taught her lessons about project management, vendor relationships, and quality control that would inform every subsequent property acquisition and development project throughout her career. The success of the Birmingham motel provided the foundation for expansion into larger properties and more prominent locations, but it also established the reputation for excellence and attention to detail that would become the hallmark of all Mrs. Carter's hospitality ventures. Her approach to customer service emphasized treating every guest with dignity and respect, while providing amenities and services that exceeded expectations regardless of the room rate or length of stay. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel that now served as the flagship property for Mrs. Carter's hospitality empire had been acquired in 1991 as a distressed asset that required complete renovation and rebranding to achieve the luxury standards that she envisioned for her premier property. The 3-year renovation project had been the most ambitious undertaking of her career, requiring coordination of architects, contractors, designers, and craftsmen to create a property that would serve as a symbol of excellence and sophistication. The staff training programs that Mrs. Carter had developed for the Grand Metropolitan emphasized the importance of treating every guest as a valued individual whose comfort and satisfaction were the primary objectives of every employee interaction. The programs included specific modules about avoiding assumptions based on appearance, providing assistance without being asked, and maintaining professional courtesy even in challenging situations. Brandon Walsh's employment at the Grand Metropolitan had begun 8 months earlier, when he was hired as assistant manager based on his hospitality management degree and his previous experience at a mid-tier hotel chain that served primarily business travelers. His training had included Mrs. Carter's customer service modules, but his application of those principles had been inconsistent and influenced by personal biases that contradicted the inclusive atmosphere she had worked to establish. The evening shift that Brandon was supervising when Mrs. Carter arrived at the hotel had been complicated by several challenging situations, including a wedding party that had exceeded noise limits and a guest complaint about room temperature that had required maintenance intervention. His stress level and impatience had been elevated before Mrs. Carter's arrival, creating conditions that made discriminatory decision-making more likely than it might have been under normal circumstances. The security protocols that Brandon invoked to justify Mrs. Carter's removal were designed to address legitimate safety concerns and to maintain the comfortable atmosphere that luxury hotel guests expected during their stays. However, the application of these protocols based on assumptions about Mrs. Carter's economic status and social acceptability represented exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that the policies were not intended to support or justify. Mrs. Carter's decision to return to the hotel and reveal her identity would transform this incident from a customer service failure into a profound lesson about assumptions, respect, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived circumstances. Her response would determine whether Brandon and his colleagues learned from this experience or simply faced consequences without gaining the wisdom that could prevent similar incidents in the future. Mrs. Carter's decision to stand on those marble steps for exactly 60 seconds was not driven by hesitation or uncertainty, but by the strategic patience that had enabled her to build a hospitality empire through careful planning and precise timing. She used those moments to observe the lobby operations through the windows, noting the staff interactions, guest service delivery, and operational details that would inform her response to the discrimination she had just experienced. Her trained eye caught subtleties that others might miss: the way servers avoided eye contact with certain guests, the preferential treatment given to visitors who displayed obvious wealth, and the casual dismissal of anyone who didn't fit the staff's narrow definition of appropriate clientele. The transformation of young Josephine from a sharecropper's daughter into Mrs. Josephine Carter, owner of a $200 million hospitality empire, had been built on her ability to turn moments of discrimination into opportunities for education and institutional change. Every insult, every assumption, and every barrier she had encountered had been transformed into motivation for achieving excellence that could not be questioned or dismissed. The woman now standing outside her own hotel had learned to channel anger into strategic action and to use prejudice as fuel for proving that assumptions about capability and worthiness were not just wrong, but catastrophically expensive for those who clung to them. The expansion of Mrs. Carter's hospitality empire from that first Birmingham motel to 12 properties across the southeastern United States had been achieved through a combination of strategic property acquisition, innovative service delivery, and operational excellence that consistently exceeded industry standards. Each hotel in her portfolio had been selected based on its potential for transformation rather than its current condition, reflecting her understanding that the most valuable opportunities often appeared in forms that others overlooked or dismissed as hopeless. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel that had just expelled her represented the culmination of Mrs. Carter's vision for luxury hospitality that combined elegance with accessibility, creating an environment where excellence was available to anyone who appreciated quality service and could afford to pay for it. The property had required a $15 million renovation that transformed a declining downtown hotel into a destination that attracted guests from around the world while serving as an economic anchor for the surrounding business district. Brandon Walsh's background as assistant manager reflected the kind of hospitality industry experience that Mrs. Carter had once hoped would produce leaders who understood both operational efficiency and customer service excellence. His degree from the University of Georgia's Hospitality Management program and his 3 years of experience at mid-tier hotel chains had provided him with technical knowledge about hotel operations. But his training had apparently failed to instill the values and perspectives necessary for inclusive customer service in luxury environments. The incident that had led to Mrs. Carter's expulsion had begun 20 minutes earlier when she entered the Grand Metropolitan lobby, carrying her worn overnight bag and approaching the reception desk to check in for the 2-night stay she had reserved under her personal name rather than her corporate identity. Her modest appearance and unremarkable luggage had immediately triggered assumptions from staff members who had been trained to assess guests based on visible indicators of wealth and social status rather than treating every person with consistent professionalism and courtesy. The front desk clerk, who had initially greeted Mrs. Carter was Maria Santos, a 23-year-old recent hospitality school graduate who had been working at the Grand Metropolitan for 6 months. Maria's interaction with Mrs. Carter had been polite but noticeably less attentive than the service she provided to guests whose appearance suggested greater affluence or social prominence. Her failure to offer assistance with luggage, provide detailed information about hotel amenities, or demonstrate the enthusiasm that characterized her interactions with other guests revealed gaps in the customer service culture that Mrs. Carter had worked to establish. The escalation that brought Brandon Walsh into the situation occurred when Mrs. Carter asked Maria about the availability of late checkout for her departure on Saturday morning, a routine request that should have been handled through simple verification of room availability and guest preferences. However, Maria's response had been dismissive and unhelpful, suggesting that late checkout was a premium service that required special approval and additional fees, rather than a standard accommodation that the hotel regularly provided to guests as a courtesy. Mrs. Carter's patience with Maria's inadequate service had been tested further when she asked about the hotel's complimentary airport shuttle service, only to be told that the shuttle was reserved for certain types of guests, and that she would need to arrange her own transportation. The suggestion that shuttle access was limited based on guest categories rather than availability represented exactly the kind of discriminatory service delivery that Mrs. Carter's policies were designed to prevent. The moment when Brandon Walsh became involved in the situation was precipitated by Mrs. Carter's calm but firm request to speak with a manager about the inappropriate service she was receiving from Maria Santos. Her professional demeanor and articulate presentation should have prompted respectful attention from any competent manager, but Brandon's initial assessment was influenced by the same prejudicial assumptions that had shaped Maria's behavior. Brandon's approach to addressing Mrs. Carter's concerns revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of both customer service principles and the inclusive hospitality culture that Mrs. Carter had established throughout her properties. Rather than investigating the specific service issues she had raised, he focused on questioning her legitimacy as a guest and suggesting that her expectations might be unrealistic for someone in her apparent economic circumstances. The conversation between Brandon and Mrs. Carter had been observed by several guests in the lobby, including Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, a wealthy elderly couple from Charleston who had been regular guests at the Grand Metropolitan for over a decade. Their reaction to witnessing what appeared to be discriminatory treatment of an elderly black woman revealed their own assumptions about appropriate clientele for luxury hotels, as they made no attempt to intervene or question Brandon's increasingly hostile behavior toward Mrs. Carter. The decision to call security was made by Brandon when Mrs. Carter persisted in requesting appropriate service despite his attempts to discourage her through dismissive treatment and barely concealed hostility. His justification for involving security was based on his characterization of her as a disruptive individual who was making unreasonable demands and creating an uncomfortable atmosphere for other guests, rather than recognizing her as a legitimate customer whose concerns deserved professional attention and resolution. The security guards who responded to Brandon's call were Tony Martinez and James Wilson, both experienced hotel security professionals who had worked at the Grand Metropolitan for over 2 years. Their training had emphasized protecting guests and staff from genuine threats, while maintaining the dignified atmosphere that luxury hotel patrons expected. But their response to Brandon's request revealed their willingness to follow orders without independently assessing the appropriateness of those instructions. The physical removal of Mrs. Carter from the hotel lobby was accomplished with the kind of professional efficiency that security guards used for ejecting individuals who posed legitimate threats or who had violated clear hotel policies. However, the application of these procedures to an elderly woman whose only offense was requesting appropriate customer service represented a catastrophic failure of judgment that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. If this story is touching your heart, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. The walk to the hotel entrance that culminated in Mrs. Carter's expulsion was witnessed by approximately 20 guests and staff members, none of whom questioned the appropriateness of removing an elderly black woman from the premises or sought to understand what circumstances had led to such drastic action. Their passive acceptance of what appeared to be discriminatory treatment reflected broader social attitudes about who belonged in luxury spaces and whose concerns deserved serious attention and respect. Mrs. Carter's dignified response to being physically escorted from her own property was informed by decades of experience with discrimination and her understanding that emotional reactions often undermined the credibility necessary for effective challenge to unjust treatment. Her calm demeanor and gracious behavior toward the security guards who were removing her demonstrated the professionalism and self-control that had enabled her to succeed in industries where others expected her to fail. The overnight bag that Mrs. Carter carried contained not just personal items for her planned hotel stay, but also business documents that would soon transform the understanding of everyone who had witnessed or participated in her expulsion. The leather portfolio inside her bag held property deeds, corporate documents, and financial statements that documented her ownership of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel and her broader hospitality empire, information that would soon turn this incident from a routine security matter into a career-defining moment for every employee involved. The decision about how and when to reveal her identity was one that Mrs. Carter had faced before in situations where she had been treated inappropriately due to assumptions about her background or circumstances. Her approach had evolved over the years from immediate confrontation to strategic revelation that maximized the educational impact while minimizing personal vindictiveness, reflecting her understanding that lasting change required teaching rather than simply punishment. The 60 seconds that Mrs. Carter spent standing outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel were used for final observation and preparation for the revelation that would follow. Her examination of the lobby through the floor-to-ceiling windows allowed her to identify additional staff members who had witnessed her treatment, guests whose reactions would need to be addressed, and operational details that would inform her response to the systemic failures that this incident had revealed. The phone call that Mrs. Carter was about to make would initiate a chain of events that would transform not just the immediate situation, but also the long-term culture and operations of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Her contact with the general manager, the human resources director, and the corporate legal team would set in motion investigations, policy reviews, and personnel decisions that would address both the specific incident and the broader issues it represented. The moment of revelation was approaching rapidly, but Mrs. Carter's choice of how to proceed reflected her decades of experience in turning moments of discrimination into opportunities for institutional change and personal growth. Her decision would determine whether this incident became simply a disciplinary matter or a more comprehensive lesson about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of hospitality service excellence. Mrs. Carter's return through the front doors of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel was deliberate and dignified, her posture radiating the quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms and business negotiations for over 4 decades. She approached the reception desk where Maria Santos was still standing, her overnight bag now unzipped, to reveal the leather portfolio that would transform everyone's understanding of power, ownership, and the catastrophic consequences of judging people by their appearance. The first document that Mrs. Carter placed on the mahogany reception desk was her business card. Josephine Carter, founder and chief executive officer, Carter Hospitality Group, with contact information for corporate headquarters, and a logo that Maria should have recognized from employee training materials and corporate communications. The elegant simplicity of the card reflected the professional standards of a major business enterprise, but the most devastating information was printed in smaller text below the corporate logo. Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a Carter hospitality property. Maria's reaction to seeing the business card was immediate and profound, her face draining of color as she processed the implications of what she was reading. The elderly black woman she had dismissed and treated with barely concealed contempt was not just a customer. She was the founder and owner of the hotel chain that employed her, the person who had created her job and who had ultimate authority over her continued employment and career advancement within the hospitality industry. "Miss Santos, Mrs. Carter said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided business decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. "I believe we were discussing late checkout options and airport shuttle availability when our conversation was interrupted. Perhaps you could help me understand the hotel policies that led you to suggest that these standard services were not available to me." The question was designed to give Maria an opportunity to explain her discriminatory behavior, while simultaneously demonstrating Mrs. Carter's detailed knowledge of hotel operations and service standards. Her reference to our conversation being interrupted was a masterful understatement that highlighted the absurdity of the owner being expelled from her own property while maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized her entire career. Brandon Walsh's awareness of the developing situation came when he noticed the commotion at the reception desk and observed Maria's obvious distress as she examined documents that Mrs. Carter had presented. His approach to the desk was confident and authoritative, reflecting his assumption that he would need to intervene again to resolve whatever problem the disruptive guest was now creating for his staff. "Ma'am, I thought I made it clear that you needed to leave the premises," Brandon announced as he reached the reception desk, his tone carrying the same condescending authority that had characterized his earlier interaction with Mrs. Carter. "If you continue to harass my employees, I'll have to call the police to have you arrested for trespassing." The threat to call police and have Mrs. Carter arrested for trespassing on her own property represented the culmination of Brandon's prejudicial assumptions and his complete failure to understand the gravity of the situation he had created. His characterization of her legitimate inquiries as harassment revealed both his discriminatory attitudes and his fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate customer service protocols. Mrs. Carter's response to Brandon's escalating threats was informed by her understanding that this moment represented more than just an employment issue. It was an opportunity to address systemic problems in customer service culture while demonstrating the kind of leadership that could transform hostile encounters into educational experiences. "Mr. Walsh, according to your name tag, you are the assistant manager who ordered my removal from this hotel approximately 10 minutes ago," Mrs. Carter said, her voice maintaining the measured tone that had commanded respect in business negotiations throughout her career. "Before you call the police, I think it would be appropriate for you to examine these documents and understand exactly who you've been threatening with arrest." The leather portfolio that Mrs. Carter opened on the reception desk contained documentation that would transform Brandon's understanding of his employment situation and his relationship to the person he had been treating with such obvious contempt. The first document was a property deed showing the purchase of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel by Carter Hospitality Group in 1991, followed by corporate registration documents, business licenses, and financial statements that established Mrs. Carter's ownership of the entire hospitality enterprise. Brandon's reaction to seeing the ownership documents was a study in cognitive dissonance and rapidly escalating panic as he processed information that challenged every assumption he had made about Mrs. Carter's identity and circumstances. The woman he had expelled from the hotel lobby was not just a legitimate guest. She was the owner of the property, the founder of the company that employed him, and the person whose policies and training programs he had been violating with every discriminatory action he had taken. This can't be right," Brandon stammered, his professional composure completely shattered as he realized the magnitude of his error. "You're saying you own this hotel, but you were dressed like... you didn't look like someone who... This doesn't make any sense." The incomplete sentences and obvious confusion in Brandon's response revealed his struggle to reconcile his prejudicial assumptions about wealth and success with the reality of the person standing before him. His reference to how she was dressed and his inability to finish his comment about how someone should look demonstrated that his worldview was colliding with facts that challenged everything he believed about appropriate appearances and social hierarchies. Mrs. Carter's response to Brandon's shock was patient and educational, reflecting her decades of experience in mentoring employees and her understanding that moments of professional failure could become opportunities for learning and growth when handled with wisdom rather than simply punishment. Mr. Walsh, I think this situation provides an excellent opportunity to discuss the customer service training that you received when you joined our company, Mrs. Carter said, her voice taking on the teaching tone that had guided employee development programs throughout her hospitality empire. Can you help me understand which part of your training suggested that guest services should be based on assumptions about appearance rather than consistent professional courtesy for everyone? The question forced Brandon to confront the disconnect between the training he had received and the discriminatory behavior he had displayed toward Mrs. Carter. His growing awareness that he had not simply been rude to a customer, he had violated company policies while insulting the person who owned the company, prompted increasingly desperate attempts to explain or justify actions that had no reasonable justification. The gathering crowd of hotel staff and guests who had witnessed Mrs. Carter's earlier expulsion now observed her revelation of ownership with a mixture of amazement, embarrassment, and growing understanding of the profound error in judgment that had occurred. The contrast between their earlier passive acceptance of her discriminatory treatment and their current recognition of her authority created an uncomfortable moment of collective accountability for assumptions and prejudices that had shaped their responses. Tony Martinez and James Wilson, the security guards who had physically escorted Mrs. Carter from the premises, approached the reception desk with expressions of growing concern as they processed the implications of the documents being discussed. Their realization that they had removed the hotel owner from her own property prompted them to consider the potential consequences for their employment and professional reputations. Mrs. Carter, we had no idea who you were, Tony said, his voice reflecting genuine remorse and professional embarrassment. Mr. Walsh told us you were a disruptive guest who needed to be removed, and we followed his instructions without questioning whether his assessment was accurate or appropriate. The security guards' willingness to acknowledge their role in the incident, while placing responsibility on Brandon's directions, demonstrated their understanding of chain of command issues and their recognition that following orders did not absolve them of responsibility for discriminatory actions. Their response also revealed the broader institutional failures that had enabled one manager's prejudices to result in the systematic mistreatment of a guest. Mrs. Carter's decision about how to respond to the security guard's apology reflected her understanding that effective leadership required addressing both individual accountability and systemic issues that enabled discriminatory behavior to occur and escalate without appropriate intervention or oversight. Mr. Martinez and Mr. Wilson, I appreciate your acknowledgement of what happened, but I want you to understand that this situation raises important questions about judgment, independent thinking, and the responsibility that every employee has to ensure that our guests are treated with dignity and respect, Mrs. Carter said, her response emphasizing both personal accountability and institutional improvement. The broader implications of Mrs. Carter's revelation extended beyond the immediate participants to encompass questions about training effectiveness, management oversight, and corporate culture that would require comprehensive review and systematic changes to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Her approach to addressing these issues would determine whether this incident became an isolated disciplinary matter or a catalyst for meaningful institutional transformation. The phone calls that Mrs. Carter was preparing to make would bring additional corporate leadership into the situation, including the general manager, who was ultimately responsible for hotel operations, the human resources director who oversaw training and employee development, and the legal team that would need to assess potential liability issues related to discriminatory treatment of guests. The transformation of this incident from a routine customer service failure into a comprehensive examination of corporate culture and employee training was exactly the kind of institutional accountability that Mrs. Carter's leadership philosophy emphasized. Her response would demonstrate whether the hospitality empire she had built truly embodied the values of respect, dignity, and inclusive service that she had worked decades to establish and maintain. Mrs. Carter's phone call to General Manager Patricia Hendricks was brief but comprehensive. conveying the essential facts of the situation while requesting immediate presence in the lobby to address what she characterized as a significant failure in customer service standards and employee training implementation. The calm authority in her voice left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation or the urgency with which it needed to be addressed by senior management. Patricia Hendrick's arrival in the lobby 7 minutes later was accompanied by Human Resources Director Michael Chen and Corporate Legal Counsel Sarah Williams, creating a senior management presence that immediately signaled to all observers that this incident had escalated far beyond routine customer service issues into territory that threatened both individual careers and institutional reputation. The transformation of the lobby atmosphere was immediate and profound, as staff members and guests recognized that they were witnessing not just the resolution of a customer complaint, but a comprehensive examination of discriminatory practices that had been operating within an organization that prided itself on inclusive service excellence. The contrast between the earlier casual dismissal of Mrs. Carter's concerns and the current urgent attention from senior leadership created an uncomfortable moment of recognition for everyone who had witnessed or participated in her mistreatment. Brandon Walsh's termination was swift and decisive, with Patricia Hendricks explaining that his discriminatory behavior toward guests violated both company policies and basic standards of human decency that were non-negotiable requirements for employment in any position within the Carter Hospitality organization. His attempts to justify his actions or minimize their significance were firmly rejected, with clear emphasis that customer service discrimination was grounds for immediate dismissal regardless of other performance factors or employment history. Mr. Walsh, your treatment of Mrs. Carter today represents exactly the kind of prejudicial behavior that our training programs are designed to prevent, Patricia Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been personally trained by Mrs. Carter in the leadership principles that guided the organization. Your employment with Carter Hospitality is terminated effective immediately, and your actions will be documented in your personnel file and reported to industry associations as appropriate. The consequences for security guards Tony Martinez and James Wilson were more complex, reflecting their subordinate role in executing Brandon's discriminatory instructions, while also acknowledging their responsibility for independent judgment in situations involving potential guest mistreatment. Their punishment included mandatory retraining, probationary employment status, and assignment to mentor relationships with senior security personnel who would help them develop better decision-making skills. Maria Santos's response to the revelation of Mrs. Carter's identity and the subsequent management intervention demonstrated genuine remorse and willingness to learn from her discriminatory behavior. Her immediate apology was followed by acceptance of additional training requirements and commitment to serving as an advocate for inclusive customer service among her colleagues, reflecting the kind of growth and accountability that Mrs. Carter's leadership philosophy emphasized. Mrs. Carter, I am deeply sorry for how I treated you today, Maria said, her voice reflecting both professional embarrassment and personal growth that could emerge from honest acknowledgement of prejudicial behavior. I realize now that I made assumptions about you based on your appearance that were both wrong and inappropriate. I want to learn how to provide better service to all our guests. Mrs. Carter's response to Maria's apology reflected her decades of experience in employee development and her understanding that lasting change required education and support rather than simply punishment for discriminatory behavior. Her approach emphasized accountability and growth while providing opportunities for redemption through demonstrated commitment to inclusive service excellence. The guest reactions to witnessing Mrs. Carter's revelation and the subsequent management response varied significantly, with some expressing embarrassment about their earlier passive acceptance of discriminatory treatment, while others demonstrated genuine surprise at learning that assumptions about wealth and status could be so dramatically wrong. The Hamilton couple from Charleston, who had witnessed the entire incident without intervention, approached Mrs. Carter to apologize for their failure to speak up when they saw her being mistreated. Mrs. Carter, my wife and I have been guests at your hotel for many years, and we should have intervened when we saw how you were being treated. Mr. Hamilton said, his admission reflecting the kind of moral accountability that Mrs. Carter hoped would emerge from this incident. We made assumptions about the situation that prevented us from acting according to our values, and we're ashamed of our failure to speak up for what was obviously wrong. The institutional transformation that Mrs. Carter initiated in response to this incident extended far beyond disciplinary actions to encompass comprehensive review of training programs, hiring practices, management oversight procedures, and customer service evaluation systems. Her approach emphasized prevention through education rather than simply punishment after problems occurred, reflecting her understanding that sustainable change required addressing underlying attitudes and assumptions rather than just correcting surface behaviors. The mandatory diversity and inclusion training that Mrs. Carter implemented throughout the Carter Hospitality Organization drew on lessons learned from this incident to illustrate the business and moral importance of treating every guest with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived economic status. The training programs included video testimonials from Mrs. Carter herself, sharing her experiences with discrimination and explaining how those experiences had shaped her approach to building an inclusive hospitality business. 6 months after the incident that had nearly resulted in her arrest for trespassing on her own property, Mrs. Carter was featured in Hospitality Industry magazine as an example of transformational leadership that could turn moments of crisis into opportunities for positive institutional change. The article described how her response to discrimination had created lasting improvements in customer service culture throughout her organization and had inspired other hospitality companies to examine their own practices and policies. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel that had expelled Mrs. Carter became a case study in hospitality management programs and diversity training workshops, demonstrating both the consequences of discriminatory customer service and the power of effective leadership in addressing systemic problems. The story resonated particularly strongly with hospitality industry professionals who recognized that assumptions about guest worthiness based on appearance could create both moral and business failures. 1 year after the December evening that changed multiple careers and transformed institutional culture throughout the Carter Hospitality Organization, the Grand Metropolitan Hotel received the National Hospitality Association's Excellence in Inclusive Service Award, recognizing both its recovery from discriminatory practices and its leadership in establishing new industry standards for respectful customer treatment. Maria Santos's transformation from someone who provided discriminatory service to an advocate for inclusive hospitality demonstrated the power of effective leadership and second chances in creating positive change. Her promotion to training coordinator reflected both her personal growth and Mrs. Carter's commitment to providing advancement opportunities for employees who demonstrated genuine learning and commitment to organizational values. The security training program that emerged from Tony Martinez and James Wilson's experience included specific modules about independent judgment, ethical decision-making, and the responsibility to question instructions that might result in discriminatory treatment of guests. Their evolution from employees who blindly followed discriminatory orders to mentors who helped other security personnel develop better judgment illustrated the comprehensive nature of the institutional changes that Mrs. Carter's leadership had created. Patricia Hendrick's management of the crisis and its aftermath demonstrated the effectiveness of Mrs. Carter's approach to developing senior leaders who could respond to challenges with both accountability and wisdom. Her swift action in addressing discriminatory behavior while implementing systematic changes to prevent future incidents reflected the kind of institutional leadership that Mrs. Carter had worked decades to establish throughout her organization. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Click the next one, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in kindness. The legacy of Mrs. Carter's response to being expelled from her own hotel extended far beyond the hospitality industry to influence discussions about discrimination, leadership, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived circumstances. Her demonstration that grace and strategic action could be more powerful than anger or retaliation inspired countless other leaders to approach workplace challenges with wisdom rather than simply implementing punitive measures. 3 years after the incident that revealed systemic failures in customer service culture, the Carter Hospitality Organization was recognized as an industry leader in diversity and inclusion practices. With other hotel companies seeking to replicate the training programs and management approaches that Mrs. Carter had developed in response to her own experience with discrimination. The elderly black woman who had been kicked out of her own hotel for appearing homeless had used that moment of injustice to create lasting change that benefited not only her own organization, but the broader hospitality industry's understanding of inclusive service excellence. Her response to discrimination had demonstrated that the most powerful way to combat prejudice was not through anger or legal action, but through the kind of educational leadership that transformed hearts, minds, and institutional cultures. The secret owner who had been expelled from her own property had revealed herself not through vindictive punishment of those who had wronged her, but through the kind of transformational leadership that created opportunities for growth, learning, and redemption. Her legacy lived on in every employee who learned to see beyond appearances, every guest who received respectful service regardless of their background, and every organization that chose education over punishment when addressing the prejudices that could destroy both human dignity and business success.